this time I have also always a problem if I should be talking with the British accent or with American accent, and it would be even more spectacular now. I think this problem will be even more spectacular now because I am dressed as a British officer from the times of the war, either of the second English civil of the second British Civil War, as the British used to say in the 18th century, or the American War of Independence, as the Americans used to say, and still use this term. And now, I am going to say a few words about this conflict, and it's a that would be very hard thing to do, to decide if I should use more American or British accent, because I use them both actually. I will try to stick to the British accent because I am dressed as a British soldier, but it can be a bit difficult. Okay, so I would like to stress out how complicated and on how many levels we can perceive this, we can observe and we can analyze this conflict. When we talk about liberal tendencies in America in the 1770s and the 1780s, because the conflict was started in the 1776 or 75 maybe, and ended in 1783. We can talk about the war that made possible to create a first liberal democracy in history, and it was of course the United States of America. Because when we take a look on, for instance, Switzerland, the Helvetic Republic, or the Dutch Republic, or the ancient Greece, ancient Athens, we can see that they were not really, democracies in the modern sense, and they were not really liberal, because usually your status was hereditary. So it was not what we perceive as a liberal democracy. But even stating that, we can observe that in even the 1770s and even earlier, this tendency for liberalization of societies was observable and very present indeed on the both sides of the Atlantic. So in the British of course there was a huge backlash against the heavy taxation implemented by the British government on American colonies after the 7 Years' War, when the British treasury was nearly bankrupt, and they wanted to make the balances more even, with heavy taxation of the colonists. And there was a huge backlash because the Americans didn't want to be taxed so heavily, and they also wanted more opportunities to create their own industry, which they were not supposed to do because of the mercantilist policy from the British Crown and from the British Parliament. They wanted to have the monopoly on industry, and Americans were just supposed to buy British products, and they were forced to. So the development of the early American industry was very much disturbed, very much hindered by the British policy. And the Americans were fed up with this, and they started these liberal tendencies that they should be more concerned with their local politics and with the local development and so on. But the same thing the very similar tendencies we can observe also in the British Parliament of that time, when you have the faction of Marquis of Rockingham, who was the leader of the main bulk of the Whig Party, the Liberal Party, and he tried very much with the help of his most able orators, among which the most able was probably Edmund Burke, but also very elderly back then, William Pitt was also taking part in these efforts. They were trying to make the government